Welcome, everyone. We are expecting over 200 people, so we will wait just a moment as folks filter into this Zoom space. We'll begin in just a moment. Welcome. If you're just coming in, there are many people populating the space, so we're just going to wait probably another 30 seconds and then we will open up. Great. Well, good afternoon. Welcome. And thank you all for joining us virtually here at the CREATE Center. We are so excited to offer the latest event in our Community Engaged Speaker Series. So we're gonna put down the slide so you can soon see our great panelists. I am Dr. Camille Wilson. I am a University Diversity and Social Transformation professor here at the University of Michigan and a professor of education. I am also the founder and director of the CREATE Center. CREATE stands for Community-Based Research on Equity, Activism, and Transformative Education. We are dedicated to nurturing research collaboratives and research-informed advocacy that unite university members and community members to improve and protect public education and to advance educational and racial justice. Our speaker series is especially designed to help us learn from and with community members. Indeed, we affirm and so greatly appreciate their wisdom and expertise, and we feel it is important to create more space within the academy to honor community-centered knowledge. This afternoon, we are especially fortunate to have a phenomenal group of community-based educators and public scholars gather to dialogue and share insight about how critical history and storytelling can inspire justice-driven educational research. Before we start, I want to thank our co-sponsors, the National Center for Institutional Diversity, NCID, and the Ginsburg Center for Community Service and Learning at the University of Michigan. Additionally, I want to thank Dr. Tonya Kneff-Chang, a CREATE Center postdoctoral research fellow and one of our panelists today, for first envisioning today's tie to critical history and storytelling. She has been vital in helping us bring Mr. Jordan, Ms. James, and Dr. Darby together with her this afternoon. So now I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, Ms. Elizabeth James. Elizabeth James is the program manager for the Department of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. She is also the department's outreach coordinator and helps to organize their study abroad programs and outreach initiatives across the country. Additionally, she is a committee member of the annual Martin Luther King Jr. Symposium here at the University of Michigan. And that symposium is the largest academic celebration in the nation. So along with serving as an advisor for the Black Student Union and the National Council of Negro Women, Elizabeth James is also a third-generation storyteller. I know she will lend great wisdom to us today. Ms. James, thank you so much again for joining us. And I will pass it to you to share more information and to introduce our panelists in a moment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. It's such an honor to be here with everyone today. And as we begin, I would like to acknowledge the lands upon which we are, whether I'm seeing that folks are from each side of the nation, and we're here in the Midwest in Anishinaabe land. So I would like to read to you a land acknowledgement that we've created here at the university. We acknowledge that the University of Michigan is named for Michigami, the world's largest freshwater system in the world, located in the Huron River watershed, which was formed and has grown through connections with the land stewarded by the Niswi, Ishkawin, Anishinaabe, the Three Fires people, who are the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, along with their neighbors, the Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, and Wyandot nations. We acknowledge the university's origins in a land grant from the Anishinaabe and Wyandot, when in 1817, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the single largest land transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered as a gift through the treaty at the foot of the rapids so that their children could be educated. We further acknowledge that our university stands, like almost all property in the United States, on lands obtained generally in unconscionable ways from indigenous peoples. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. Knowing where we are neither changes the past nor the present. However, through scholarship and pedagogy, we work to create a future where the past is understood and the present supports justice while enacting an ethic of care and compassion. I would like now to give a little framing of what we'll be doing today. In the beginning was the Word in the world. This was an ancient proverb given from West Africa that describes how we as humans have grown through our sense of storytelling. It's what makes us human and brings us together in ways that are illuminating and enlightening. Ida B. Wells Barnett wrote once, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." For Miss Wells Barnett, illuminating the truth was a civic duty, an imperative of justice, and a matter of life and death. Though she was writing 130 years ago, her words are salient for our contemporary moment, as we've seen over the weekend with our recent tragedies across the nation. And as we work together, focused on the experiences of communities of color, they're being waged also in educational institutions across the United States. As such, educators, such as the ones we have here today, turn the light of truth on our nation's wrongs, and they face backlash, censorship, hostility, and threats of violence. However, the histories we learn and the stories we tell are situated in the struggles for social justice, civil rights, and human dignity. And so we're very fortunate today to have folks who have come together to talk about these issues and try to help us think through the possibilities and the limitless range of all that we can do through working with critical history and storytelling. I'd like now to introduce our panelists. The first is one of my secret favorite people in the world, but now it's not so secret, Jamon Jordan. He's an educator, writer, and historian, known as Baba Jamon. He has been a teacher of African and African American history for 20 years and a researcher of Black history for decades. He taught at the African Center in Sirrita Institute in Detroit for 10 years. He now runs the Black Scroll Network History and Tours, where he leads tours and presentations dealing with African and African American history in the Detroit area, and now throughout Michigan and the United States. He's given over 100 tours and presentations for Detroit Public Schools, Walled Lake Public Schools, oh my goodness, everywhere, numerous charter schools, and so on, as well as university class groups from Wayne State University, Michigan State, Georgetown, New York University, and the University of Michigan, where he is teaching now as well. He has given hundreds of lectures and presentations, and he's just a staple in our community. Next, we have Tonya Kneff-Chang. She's a critical historian and public scholar. Tonya examines stories of resistance in the shadows of history to help us understand the past, make sense of the present, and ultimately illuminate paths toward liberation and justice. Integrating critical historical methodologies and critical race and social theories, her research focuses on racialized violence, collective resistance, and the transformative power of education. Her collaborative public engagement projects include Invisible Voices, which I was honored to work with her on, an intergenerational podcast series, and Don't Leave Us Behind, a documentary about literacy and reading policy in Michigan. As a postdoctoral researcher at the CREATE Center, Tonya is part of the School Shuttering and Equitable Educational Access Study. That was a mouthful, which situates school closures within historical struggles for educational access, equity, and racial justice. She co-teaches the Race and Racism in Medicine course at the University of Michigan's Medical School. Tonya's BA is in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and from the University of Michigan. She has a master's in educational leadership and policy, and a PhD in educational foundations and policy. Last but certainly not least is another hero, or better yet, shero. Sirrita Darby. Dr. Sirrita Darby is the co-founder and executive director of Detroit Heals Detroit. Born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, Sirrita has always been committed to combating social justice inequities. As an abolitionist educator in Detroit, she saw how trauma infiltrated the lives of her students inside and outside of the classroom. There, she developed a strong commitment to centering healing in the classroom and in her community. As an extension of a class project, Sirrita founded Detroit Heals Detroit alongside her students to foster healing for other Detroit youth. Sirrita earned her doctorate in educational leadership at the I'm so used to University of Michigan, at Michigan State University, where she did extensive research on trauma in Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, and analyzed the radical solutions necessary to combat it. She also received a master's degree from the University of Michigan and a bachelor's degree in social relations and policy from Michigan State University. Sirrita is committed to helping create Black, Indigenous, and people of color healing spaces that lift up joy, brilliance, hope, and justice, promoting healing for liberation and not just for survival. Welcome to you all. We'd like to start today's session by talking about journeys and the journeys that each of us have gone on as we made our way into this work that we love and care for so deeply. Jamon, could you start us out by talking a little bit about the path you've taken on your way to where you are now and how you believe that it has informed you in becoming the educator that you are today?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you for that introduction and those kind words. And I just want to say welcome to everybody. And I'm happy to, all of a sudden, I can't see myself. Okay, let me, I don't know what my lighting just did. I don't know if that helps, but it's still not good. All right, well, I'm going to do the best I can. I don't know where my lighting just went. I'm going to, I guess, talk about how I got to where I am today. And I was born and raised here in the city of Detroit. I was born very close to Highland Park. So there's a city that is totally surrounded by the city of Detroit, except one little smidgen of Highland Park touches Hamtramck, which is another city that's totally surrounded by the city of Detroit, except a little smidgen that borders Highland Park. So I grew up in Detroit, but right at the Detroit-Highland Park border. And I attended schools in both districts. And I grew up, born and raised in the city of Detroit, born in the 70s. So I'm a 70s and 80s child. So I was a child in the 70s and the 80s. And when I graduated from high school, I went to college, Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, and I triple majored in Black Studies, Sociology, and American Studies. And then when I graduated, I became a teacher at first in Kalamazoo. I was a substitute teacher in Kalamazoo before I was hired for the first school here in the city of Detroit. And it was at the Wayne County Juvenile Detention Facility. That was the first school that I taught at, was at the Wayne County Juvenile Detention Facility. And it was probably one of the most rewarding experiences as a teacher that I had, was teaching at the Wayne County Juvenile Detention Facility, because it was clear that I was needed in this place. It was clear that education was needed. And it was clear that some of the education that I was doing was needed. So when I first started teaching there, the teachers who were really devoted to the students knowing something about Black history had to do it on their own, because it wasn't in the textbook. It wasn't in the curriculum. So there were a few of us who were, we were committed to making sure that the students knew this information, and that we hoped that it helped them in their journey. And so we had to do that on our own. And then even when I left that school and was working at other schools, it was the same thing. African-American history, Black history wasn't really a part of the curriculum. Some schools would do something special on Black History Month. So you'd get some kind of at least rudimentary, basic lessons about Black history. Generally, people that we all have heard of many times: Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, people like that, who are important for us to learn, but it's just very limited to what the students ought to be knowing. And so I began to have to do that on my own. So I began to create lessons on my own to include this information in my classroom. So I had to gather news articles. I had to break down books that may have been written at a college level, but create lessons from them for my middle school and elementary students. And then the school started to get better about that. So I started working at schools that got better about that. And then, of course, when I worked at Inseroma, which was the African Center School, that was the foundation of the curriculum, was Black history. So no problem with Black history at that school. And I worked there for 10 years as a middle school teacher, middle school social studies teacher. So nothing was missing in Black history except Detroit's Black history. So my students were learning about Montgomery, Selma, Alabama. They were learning about the Mississippi Freedom Summer. They were learning about Harriet Tubman on the Underground Railroad on the East Coast. They were learning about the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. They were learning about Malcolm X as the minister of Nation of Islam in Temple Number 7 in Harlem, and even when he left, still being a Harlem-based activist and speaker. But they weren't learning how Detroit was a part of all of those stories. Detroit was a part of the Civil Rights Movement, part of the Underground Railroad, a part of Malcolm X, part of the Black Power Movement, part of the Black Panther Party. Detroit is part of all of that history. And so my students were missing that part. And so I began taking them on field trips so they could see the sites that were related to the history that they were learning about other places, how that history is directly related to their life here in the city of Detroit. And their parents were going on those field trips with them as chaperones. And many of the parents were like, hey, I've been living here for 30 years, 40 years, and I never knew that was around the corner. I never knew that place was there. I never knew the history behind that. And so they were really intrigued in most cases and really interested in learning more. And so they were starting to bring people with them on the field trips. And I would have to stop these people. And you can't bring just a random person on a field trip with children, you know, but they were really trying to introduce some of the people. They had gone and told their friends about what they learned. And some of their friends like, I don't believe all of that. That can't happen. I've been living here all this time and you telling me that was here all along? So they wanted to go on the field trips to find out for themselves. And I had to turn them away because you can't bring just strangers on field trips with little children. So I began doing this in my spare time on the weekends and in the summers. I began taking people who were not my students on these history tours so they would learn about the city of Detroit. And in 2013, I started Black Scroll Network History and Tours, which is a company that focuses on Detroit's African-American history. And I was running that business since 2013, and in 2020 or 2021, the University of Michigan, who was probably my biggest university client. So they took more tours with me than any other university, University of Michigan. I was asked to become a teacher of Detroit's Black history for the semester in Detroit program. So I've been doing that for 2 semesters now. And now, and then shortly after that, the city of Detroit asked me to become the official historian for the city of Detroit. So I was appointed in October of 2021. So those things happened, but at my core, I'm still a middle school teacher. I'm a middle school social studies teacher. That's really what I am. So despite all the other things that I do, at my core, I'm still a middle school social studies teacher who incorporates Black history because it's missing from our curriculum, particularly Detroit's Black history. And so that's really the short version of my story. And I'm going to find a way I can get a better lighting, so I'm going to move.
Okay, thank you so much. That you can just see the river flowing in your life, taking you on this incredible journey that, you know, is all about knowledge sharing. And I think that's core to all of us who are interested in trying to find ways to help, particularly our young people, understand and begin to cherish themselves through learning about how amazing our history is. As a public librarian in Detroit, so often my greatest joy came from that sharing of information in very casual ways that then led them into books and, you know, trying to find out more about themselves. Tonya, I know that you've had a long history of just being so committed to the work that you do in terms of, you know, just all that you've been studying, doing your research over the course of your PhD. Could you share with us some of your story?
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. And just to echo Jamon, I'm so thrilled to be here with all of you. What a great honor today. So like any great journey, mine begins with my mama, honestly. I adore her and have always adored her. And one of the things that she always showed me was how she stood up and had to fight over and over and over again. And I just valued the way that she would stand up for herself. But by the same token, that other side of that was the violence that surrounded those fights. And this is the literal violence that she was dealing with as she was. So on one hand, I was so thrilled to know that my mom could stand up and fight. And as I got older, I thought, this violence is ridiculous, having to constantly fight for everything, literally with your hands. Me, the oldest of 5, having to gather the children around and try to shield them when things were happening around violence. You do it because you have to, but I had no idea that it would actually be the thing that I end up doing. And so everything about my work is connected to how do we intervene on system structures, acts of violence. And absolutely, race and racism is completely intersected in this, and that's what's become my life work. And I think that the component about understanding the complexities around race and racism came a little bit later. I moved to Georgia for high school, and like 73% of all Georgia schools, I went to a mandatory, it was a mandated school that had a desegregation plan. So these still exist today. I know a lot of people think about desegregation as happening in the 1950s, 60s, and even 70s, but 73% of schools roughly are still operating in this model in a lot of places in the South. And my experience of that school was that there was a lot of tension, a lot of potential for racialized violence, a lot of things that were happening that we could see, but that was never, ever, ever explained or talked about. We didn't talk about race. We just knew that if you had a homecoming, you had to have one white student represented and one Black student represented. If you had a set of speeches, you had to have one Black student represented for the speech and one white student. But absent that context, it felt like it was wrong. It felt like, what are we doing here? Why are we so focused on the numbers? Because we didn't have any opportunity to understand where that was coming from. And in my path, I decided that I was going to study violence first and thought I was going around the international route. And so I moved to Japan and started investigating peace monuments and peace memorials, because I was curious how communities could come together after incredible acts of violence and how they then could welcome other people from the communities that then committed that violence upon them. And that became how I was thinking about the world. And once I was done with Japan, I guess, or it was done with me, we're not sure, I decided to come back to the United States for graduate school. And I suppose there's something very powerful in stepping away for nearly 10 years and then coming back and having the benefit of hindsight and a little maturity for me to be able to then question the things that I knew and experienced. So growing up in Georgia in an integrated situation, being surrounded by violence, not only in my own home and thinking around poverty and what that meant, but also what I was experiencing around my community. And then looking at how do I even explore this in its intersections? And so that's what I ended up doing in the graduate school career. So I look at racialized violence as embedded in our social foundations and institutions, and explicitly in education. And in the end, I'm always trying to get to how do we do this work so that we can move away from violence, so that we can think about conflict in ways that actually lead to healing, which I know can speak directly to what some of Dr. Darby's work is.
Absolutely. As you were saying that, it was making me think a lot about the work that I have heard of that Dr. Darby is doing, this moving past the trauma, moving into a space of healing and trying to create those spaces in sometimes, areas where you're still having to grapple with the conflict. So please, Sirrita, could you share with us part of your journey and how you came to find, this incredible work that you're doing?
Yes. Peace family, echoing both of my other amazing individuals in this space. I'm just happy to be here. I was had the pleasure of being taught by Dr. Kneff-Chang, so that is amazing. And I've done Black Scroll Networks with Baba Jamon. So again, this is just full circle. We are all in community today. But again, I'm Dr. Sirrita Darby, she, her pronouns. And I was born and raised in Detroit, East Side to be specific. And so seeing just growing up and just seeing how amazing Detroit is, loved it, right? So when I went to college, it was very, very different for me. It was huge, right? Went to a PWI and that was very different. But I took an educational policy class and that's when I realized how messed up our education system is and how I want to be a solutionary for that. And so I wasn't a teacher major, but I found our alternative route to teaching, and I knew that I wanted to go back to Detroit specifically to teach. So I did that. I went back home to the community in which I was raised in. So that was very important to me. I always tell teachers to really live in the community in which you teach in, because a lot of teachers go home to their suburban cul-de-sacs at the end of the day and leave, our students to deal with the census nation on their own. But also when you're a community member as well as a teacher, you see from a different lens. So as I was teaching, I saw how trauma not only manifests in the classroom, because that's undeniable, we all see that, but also how it manifests in the community. And so when I went to our administration and said we need trauma counselors, they told me that we don't have enough money and that they need grit. And in the words of Dr. Vasinila, there's no amount of grit that can fight off the intersection of living in poverty. So that's not what they needed. They had grit from their ancestors. So grit is gimmick. That's not what they needed. So that wasn't good enough for me. My students will always tell you my motto was to find a way, make a way. And so I found a way to make my classroom a space of healing. So where we did healing circles every Friday, had to circumvent required curriculum that didn't affirm their shared experiences or identities, and was definitely micromanaged because of it, threatened to be fired plenty of times because of it. But I tell teachers again, if you're not willing to put your job on the line for the liberation of Black and Brown youth, then you probably shouldn't be teaching Black and Brown youth. So again, like Baba Jamon said, the curriculum didn't speak to the history that my students that came from, right? And if it did speak on the history, it spoke on the trauma. Like, we're not talking, if you're going to tell the story of Black people, you need to tell the whole story, not just the trauma, because our people are more than just the trauma. But we leaned into our stories. And so I had my students write their stories in using forms of like poetry, essays, anything they wanted. Some people did art, and we used those stories that they wrote to combine a book known as Forbidden Tears, stories, poems, and essays of trauma from the imprisoned voices of unapologetic Black youth. So word about their book got around. This was something that people probably haven't seen before. So they got invited to other Detroit schools to do this healing work completely on their own. I taught them how to do it, and I told them, you all don't need me, right? This healing work, you all are capable of doing on your own. And they went to so many schools and they came back, they were like, Ms. Darby, we really want to create an after school program out of this. And I was like, after school program sounds dope, right? But if this work has to exist and really wants to enact change, this has to happen in community as well. I honestly believe that schools uphold systems of racial equity, then can be a true source of racial healing. So we cannot just do this work in schools. So I was like, let's take it a step further and create a nonprofit. And if they were serious and to write me a business plan, I would support them 100%. And I believe that was like on a Monday. And by that Friday, I had a wedding to go, so I didn't come to school. And they FaceTimed me like, Ms. Darby, where are you? We got the business plan. And I was like, oh, okay, FaceTime me during lunch. And it's funny, we posted that on our social media not too long ago where they FaceTimed me and they had their business plan on the board and they walked me through it. And I'm just like floored by them. Like, wow, like you guys are serious. Like you really want to bring this healing to the rest of your community and your peers. Which is amazing. This is what becomes possible when we give young people the tools to solve their own problems. And just want to speak to the fact that I wasn't at a school that was the top tier. This school closed down the next year because it was a low performing school. These students were students that a lot of teachers have given up on. These are not when you look at my students, they're not nonprofit leaders. They're teen moms. They've been shot at. They've been in jail. But again, when you give young people the tools they need to solve their own problems, this becomes possible. When they're able to tell their stories and actually heal, this is what becomes possible. So we've since then been able to manifest Detroit Heals Detroit, where our mission is to foster healing justice for other Detroit youth, in which they're able to transform their pain into power, while simultaneously combating systems of inequity that contributes to the trauma in the first place. So I honestly believe you cannot combat the trauma in individuals if you're not combating the systems and the systemic issues that kind of creates that trauma in the first place. So when we go into a lot of schools and do professional development, everyone can agree that trauma exists with students, but no one wants to talk about the history of how we got here, right? What is the history? Because that kind of infiltrates whiteness, right? Now we're implicating you and your history, and no one wants to be put on display when it comes to that, but we have to if we really want to make changes in the present to better our future. So that's what we're committed to doing. We consider ourselves a social justice organization that does mental health work, and we're really leaning into storytelling and the history to really do that work that we will continue to do. Yes.
Yes, I love it. This is the thing about storytelling is its capacity for healing, and it helps us to remember who we are. The beautiful concept of Sankofa, looking back in order to move forward. This is about history, but it's about, as you said, all of history. It reminds me so much of the work I did at Detroit Public Library. The kids would come in and they'd say, you have all these books around here, but where's something about me? And so we actually did work together, and they made their own little books. They wrote their life stories and we put them on the shelves. It was such a powerful and empowering thing for them, that when they would come in, they would show their friends and say, oh, here's our section of the library, which, it is their library. It's in their community. So making sure that the voices of those who are living in these spaces, that they feel as though this is where they belong, because everywhere that they are within that community is where they belong, So I just love that, this is something, I have witnessed when I've been driving in the city and I'll see Baba Jamon on a corner with a crowd around him, and he's sharing these stories and the power of that. I just am wondering, Jamon, in terms of how being a teacher has impacted you and your understanding about how we learn and engage with history, how your work with Black Scroll grew out of your sharing the history. Could you speak to us about that?
Yes, thank you. Of course I can, because what I found and what we all knew, and I knew that when I got out of college and when I was studying Black studies and sociology, when I became a teacher, what we all knew was that if students and if people in general, not just young children, but adults too, if you are learning about people who are more like you, you're more likely to be more involved in the learning process, because you feel like it's not something that's being imposed on you. It's really people bringing out the education that's already within you. And so this is an African way of understanding reality. Is not that we're doing the banking method. We are implanting stories and we're implanting education into people, and they're just a empty vessel, that they have greatness within them. They have these skills, they have knowledge within them. And what we're trying to do is bring it out and make it manifest. And so education for me is not putting something in, it is bringing something out. So knowing that already, and then adding to that, okay, so if my students are almost all African American, they're all Black, almost all Black in Wayne County Juvenile Detention Facility, and in almost every other school I ever taught. When I taught in Inkster, when I taught in Southfield, when I taught in Detroit, almost all of my students were Black. So knowing that most of my students are Black, and they're learning Black history, because I'm there and I'm making sure that they learn it, and I'm finding that they're more engaged and more accessing that information than they would if it was all about things that have nothing to do, or they feel have nothing to do with them. I learned that just take it the next step. Now learning about your own neighborhood or things that happen in your own community, that makes it even that much more accessible. That makes them much more understanding. So I wanted them to not just know Black history in the general, but Black history on their street, Black history at the school that they're attending, Black history in the neighborhood they grew up in and when their parents grew up in, and Black history from the places that their parents came from before they came to the city of Detroit, and show how all these things are interrelated to one another. And so as they began to learn that, on top of that, I want them to stand in the places where the history happened. So I took them on these field trips because I thought that getting out of the four walls of the school would increase their access to this education. And so my classroom is much bigger than the school classroom. So we go to the historic sites so they can stand in the places where the things happen. They can stand where the uprising was to free Thornton and Lucy Blackburn from slavery, where Black people came together to free this husband and wife from the clutches of bounty hunters. They can stand where Reverend Clarence LaVaughn Franklin preached, and where his young daughters were singers in the choir, Carolyn, Irma, and Aretha Franklin. And they can stand where African Americans saved the Detroit Symphony Orchestra Hall from closing the first time it was about to close in the 1940s after the Great Depression, when African Americans bought it and took it over as the Paradise Theater and ran it from 1941 to 1951. And so when they go to the Symphony Orchestra Hall today and see their student present performances, because students perform there, when they see the actual symphony orchestra play, when they go to a jazz performance there, when they go to whatever kind of performance they go there, they can be centered in this history. And when they go back to their parents and sometimes grandparents and say, hey, I learned about Paradise Theater, or I learned about the Greystone Ballroom, I learned about the Flame Show Bar, I learned about the Gotham Hotel. Their parents and grandparents like, hey, I remember this place. Or I remember my mama talking about this place. Oh, I never knew where that was. Or not only do I know where it was, your aunt used to work there, so now it becomes full circle. I did my part when they came to my class, or when they took my tour, or when they had me lecture, but when they go home and talk to their circle about this, then they get another education about what they've already learned. Not just planted a seed, but that other part is blooming. It is bringing out of them. This history is in them, it's in their ancestors, it's in their elders. And when they learn that little part from me, they go back and more of that story comes full circle for them right there in their own life, in their own family, in their own household. That is what I think is the most important thing that I do. I mean, that's not all I do, but I think more importantly is the things that people are going to be able to go and talk to their own folks about. They can go talk to their people about what they learned from me. That's more important than them turning in a paper and getting an A on it and all of that. What's more important is that they can go back, talk to people they know, and expand the story that they got the kernel from me.
Beautiful. It just reminds me that as a storyteller, all the stories, when I say third generation, it's because I'm telling those stories that my grandmother taught me, that my mother taught me. These stories are flowing through me from my ancestors, and each of us have that capacity. So, when grandmama would talk about Paradise Valley, or she'd talk about Black Bottom and going out and dancing, the reason why, even in the midst of struggling through the Depression, there was a lot of joy that was also happening, and it enabled them to make it through those challenging times. And that's, the interweaving of all these stories that create the entire spectrum of all that we are, as opposed to just looking at these, slices. We're looking at the whole picture. And so that brings me to Tonya. Could you explain a little about what critical history actually is? For those, we talk a lot about storytelling, we talk about critical history, we talk about these different things, but for those who don't know, could you share with us what that is?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think Jamon has offered an example of how that's practiced just in the work. And I really appreciate you, Jamon. I've been on several of your tours, and one of the things I remember was once when we were all on the school bus together listening to you. And another aspect of that was this communal experience where we were listening. Jamon would say something, and then Marsha Pilpot would come up and say, you know what, I remember when this happened over here. And then you have another community member say, well, this is what happened with this. And now the stories are part of all of our stories and all of our experience. And that was a really powerful component for understanding how history gets done. And that's one of the critical parts. So when we think of critical history, a lot of people hark it back to critical theory, which was a set of theories that came out of what was known as the Frankfurt School in the 1920s. And these are folks who were seeing the rise of Nazism and really just questioning the world around them, wondering how power was playing into how people were engaging and what that then meant for social change. And so they were asking questions of power. And when we do critical history, I think one of the things we do is first acknowledge that there is some master narrative. There are narratives out there that are dominant and that are powerful and that continue to be reproduced in so many kinds of contexts, not just in the common educational implements that we know, like textbooks, but through every narrative we see, through the images that we see, through the billboards that are up, through the shows that are on, like you mentioned, Elizabeth, through the books that are there or not there. And the other component of that is that what is not represented speaks really loudly, really loudly. So it's that component of erasure, that the stories have been erased, especially stories around Black communities and the incredible efforts that Black communities have done to literally do all of the amazing things in our country. So that our public school education would not have been developed in the way that it had if it weren't for the efforts of the freed people who, just coming right out of enslavement, were able to take their petitions and march to the Capitol and say, we're willing to tax ourselves to pay for this. That model was not really around, especially in the South, not in mass. And so these kinds of stories are incredibly powerful. So acknowledging that master narrative and then understanding where the counter narratives are, finding, elevating, supporting them. And I think that component around community is also really important, especially when I think about my work as somebody who tells stories of communities of which I'm not a part of, is how do I engage with other people as I'm learning about this history, as I'm examining and sitting through it, as I go on a tour and am part of a community and learning with others, because I think it shifts a little bit when I experience it with someone else. And I think there's great responsibility in that, which leads to a third component of critical history, and that is the action orientation or the commitment to either some component of morality or justice, however it's defined, that is explicit and intentional. We are unapologetic about understanding that there are real problems that have to be addressed, and that history is one of those realms that we address, and we can do it collectively. It's not the only realm, but we have to be able to understand our past in order to make sense of the present. And I think it actually works in both directions, that we understand our present by also thinking about the past. So that's something I'm thinking about, is how that all works in critical history. The last bit I'll say is usually historians are all about the archives, and Sirrita, you know about this. We did a project which actually came out of my experience with Jamon. I had such a great experience that I said, I'm going to do this with my students. So I was teaching teachers in Detroit. They were all teaching, they were coming from all over. And I thought, you know what, they don't know anything about the city. So how can I help them learn about it? First of all, I'm going to construct an assignment that makes you go do a historical inquiry in the community. You are going to have to talk to people in your community. You're going to have to go into that barbershop. You're going to have to go to those archives. You're going to have to see what it's like. And then also thinking about a subject that was really important at the time in the city, and that was school closures. And so they had to investigate. They had to figure out, how hard is it to get information? How hard is it to find out why the school closed? What are the kinds of questions you want to ask people in order to find things out? And so it's these kind of untraditional methods in order to counter erasure, to lift up stories that are often on the margins or shadowed. There's all kinds of metaphors to describe them. Those are some of the components of critical history.
Gosh, thanks so much. You see how it all fits together in such a beautiful way. And, you know, I'm thinking, Sirrita, about how you described to us about forbidden tears and the students working and, I mean, becoming so engaged and coming up with their business plan and, you know, all the things with Detroit Heals Detroit that you're doing. Tell me why you believe, and I know that I firmly believe that it's imperative that our youth be engaged in their history and in telling their stories. Could you speak to what public engagement means for our youth and for how, you know, them finding their voices and lifting them up is so important for the healing of our city and for the future of our city?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Like being a practitioner in education, being a teacher, I think it's always important to center student voice and making sure that's not performative, right? I believe that students are the center of the learning. And if you as a teacher believe you're the center of learning, that's actually a white supremacist belief, and it should be cute, right? We should let that go and have students really be the center. So I always ask my students, what do you all want to teach or learn about? What do you all want to do? And making sure I'm centering that and lifting that up, and not just like taking that inquiry and just, you know, letting it dissolve over time. But again, like I said, when students are the center, so many things become possible. When their voices are heard, and what Baba Jamon said, when they see their self in what they're learning, they're more engaged. They want to learn more. They want to come to class. I've had students who came to my class and left for the rest of the day because they needed that sense of I belong here, right? This classroom is for me. And I know Tonya was talking about violence earlier. I know I posted this in the chat, but I always ask teachers, is your classroom violent? And they're like, no, we don't really have anything going on. Okay, there may not be fights, but is your classroom, you physically may not be violent, but is it culturally violent, right? Are you talking about their culture in your classroom? If not, then it's violence. If white supremacy is at the center of your curriculum and white people's at the core, your classroom is violent, right? If we're not interrogating whiteness, when white supremacy, we know it's alive and well. We know that from this weekend with the tragedy that happened this weekend, right? We could talk about gun control, but if you're not centering white supremacy in that conversation as well, we're only solving half of the issue, right? So again, how violent is your classroom? And if you do a inquiry, I know we learned about social justice tools when I was in Dr. Kneff-Chang's class, and really giving them a social justice tool to really inquire and do an audit of like, is your classroom violent? And is it culturally, physically, or racially violent? And really changing that so our young people feel safe. And that's the first step. If I can walk in your classroom and feel safe, if I can walk in your classroom and do, you know, the Dougie or do a cultural dance and feel safe and not feel like you are diminishing me and who I am as a person, and you're actually lifting up who I am instead. Because a lot of times we know Black students in classrooms get punished for simply being, right? If we look, it's literally just them being who they are, they get punished for. So we look at the data, and I always tell people, as soon as I became a researcher, and I'm the research person for Detroit Heals Detroit too, because a lot of people want to deny, you know, is this what we need to be doing? But you can't deny the research. So the research says this works. So I'm doing research now on how social emotional learning is done in predominantly white institutions with young people versus predominantly students of color institutions, and how it's used as a discipline tool versus, oh, these students are learning these soft skills when it comes to SEL. And looking at the stark difference between that and making sure we're creating a framework to where everyone is lifted up in this SEL curriculum and not just watching a video where they're not even represented in and then telling them to talk about their feelings and that's just SEL. It's not, right? If you're not talking about race in your SEL curriculum, and race is one of the biggest source of trauma for Black and brown students, then you're not doing it right, right? I know Dana, I forget her last, I think Dana Gilmore tells us that SEL without really interrogating race is just white supremacy with a hug. And I totally agree with that, that you really have to talk about that and making sure students are talking about what they want to talk about in the classroom and lifting up what they want. And censoring their voice. I always tell teachers, don't work harder than your students. They should, Dina Simmons, thank you, Nicole. Never work harder than your students. I'm merely a facilitator. They do the hard work and they are the souls of the operation. And they will always tell me like, you know, Miss Darby, you're the best teacher I ever had. And I always turn around them like, no, you all are the best teachers I ever had. I think I learned more from them than I can ever teach them in a lifetime, which is why we need to be centering student voices and really getting like Baba Jamon said, like they already have it in them. Like I felt that, like they are knowledgeable, they are experts, and we really just need to get that out of them and teach in a way in which we're able to get that out of them, right? So really using those tools and those strategies that are not archaic, but actually work and lean into new strategies that actually work and lean into the research as well that says this works, so we need to be doing it this way.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. Just hearing this is making my heart sing, because my master's thesis was on the importance of children seeing themselves in picture books to raise their self-esteem. Early on, my favorite books as a child were The Snowy Day and Corduroy. And it was because they were little Black children. And that changed the course of, thank goodness my mom was a librarian. So she was looking and searching for books that had, us depicted in them. But when you think about it on a large scale level, it just only makes sense that folks will gravitate to that which seems familiar and which feels like home. That's where how you grow, and that's where you first learn is, within your family, then to your community. So speaking about community, I was wondering if Jamon, you and Sirrita could speak a little bit about how can we do more to bring community-based learning into university settings? How can we help people to move away from, I don't want to say just the theoretical, but how do we find ways? I think Semester in Detroit's an excellent way because you're literally bringing folks to the city. I know I've done study in Broads to New Orleans and Detroit to help our students here, understand that the wealth of knowledge that is right literally in their backyard. So how would you suggest ways to do that in healthy and engaging ways?
Yeah, so I would second what you said about Semester in Detroit and programs like that. There are other programs that are similar to that, where the students are placed in the community. They live in the community. They are partnering with institutions and organizations in that community as part of their learning. They're learning in class about that community. People from the community, organizers, teachers, elders, business folks, and just regular folks who grew up, born and raised in those neighborhoods, come to those students and tell them about what that community is like, grounding the students in the understanding of the history and legacy of that neighborhood, that community, that city, that town, that area. So I am a proponent, I am a supporter of that kind of thing being added to many educational programs, something similar to that, where you take the students into the community and give them a deep dive into that community, but you also bring the people from the community to the students and they meet. And so that needs to happen. People should not, this happens even in universities that are in cities. So of course, U of M is in Ann Arbor, Wayne State is in Detroit. I went to Western, which is in Kalamazoo. There are people who go to Western Michigan University, because I was there, and they're there for their bachelor's, their master's, and even their doctorate. They don't know nothing about Kalamazoo. They know about Western, they know about the college. And I know it's the same for U of M. There are people who go to U of M, they get their bachelor's, they may stay there for the master's, they may come for their doctorate, and they know about Ann Arbor, but they don't know nothing about the issues that are going on in Ann Arbor with all kinds of folks, with women, with the LGBT community, with the Black community, they don't know anything that's going on those fronts, with people who are poor, with people whose waters are being shut off. They don't know nothing about that. It's divorced from them. And so any way that we can bridge the university community with the actual indigenous and living community is a important endeavor, and it will add to whatever education that the people, that the students are getting or not getting. So yeah, I am a proponent of that. I mean, it's really what I was doing with middle school. They're in the school, but I want to take them out of the school and have them go to the places where the stuff happened. In many of those places, there would be a person that I knew who was a part of that story, who would talk to the students. And so, of course, when we're talking about the Underground Railroad, I can't give them a living person, but they would meet the descendants of people who were part of the Underground Railroad. And so to let them know that that story is part of present day, because there are people who are here because of their ancestor escaping on the Underground Railroad. So yeah, we have to find ways to bridging the university with the actual community.
I want to echo. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, please, Sirrita, join in.
Yes, I'm going to be very brief. I want to echo that and say, yes, get them into these communities, but I don't think that's enough. So a fun fact about me is I travel, right? Dr. Kneff-Chang knows I've traveled to over 50 countries, right? And one of the quotes that people always bring up in the travel community is the Mark Twain quote, "Travel is fatal to prejudice." All that, I don't know the quote because I don't believe in it, but the quote is false. People come with their prejudices also, and most often leave with them too when they go to these countries. Same as communities. You can go to Detroit and have your prejudice. You're going to most often leave with them too, unless you're really engaged in community and you're becoming a community member. It's not enough just to visit and live here, right? Because we have people do that, right? And these people are situated in downtown, midtown. They don't even know what Detroit is beyond that, right? So you really have to get in this community, engage with these people, go to city council meetings, be a community member, go to these school board meetings and actually engage with the community outside of Midtown or Detroit, downtown Detroit, right? And that's when you're really going to be able to change your perspective and the narrative on what you thought Detroit was. As we say, Detroit's coming back, we never left. So that narrative is so like, we've always been here and we're going to continue to be here. But again, if you're not really being strategic and intentional about it, then again, you're going to come with your prejudice and what you believe. You're going to most often leave with that as well. So being intentional about that.
That's so true. That's so true. I know that, when we had one group of U of M students, I brought them to the city to train them to be doulas at Henry Ford Hospital. And so we were called doulas in the D, and it was wonderful, but it was really a case of, you could see the tension and the anxiety that a lot of them felt when I would take them beyond, that downtown, midtown area, and we'd start heading into the real neighborhoods, going to do the work. And it was just incredible. And bit by bit, breaking down those barriers as they became more and more immersed. That's where I felt the real transformation was taking place, because it wasn't, just for them to be in the dorms at Wayne State and be there for those 8 weeks. We had to go and really put in the work of talking with the expectant mommies, doing that work that was going to really have them interacting with community members on a deep and meaningful basis, because this was important work, and Detroiters deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, no matter where they are in the city. So it was really powerful. And I think that both of you all, what you spoke to definitely speaks to that whole notion. I see that Jamon had to leave us. His daughter has become ill. And so we're sorry and I hope that she'll be feeling better. But I do see that we have some questions. And so I will take a peek and see if we can pose those to you all. Someone asked, much of the work that you all do around storytelling occurs at the intersection of various disciplines. How do you reconcile the tensions between humanities approaches and social sciences approaches, not only in your research, but in your teaching? I am thinking specifically of how to employ storytelling methods in coursework while acknowledging the limits of my own cultural studies training. Ah, very interesting. So what do you think?
Well, I'll start probably because I did a lot of this intersectional and interdisciplinary work. And first of all, I think one of the things that comes with doing interdisciplinary work is that it does require extra work. And I think to the degree that we think about how to plan for that and plan for the support that we need in that will matter. And I think there are real limitations if you're doing it in the academy. For me, I had to find communities within different disciplinary departments. And it was within those communities that we were able to not only commiserate on the different challenges that were structurally based within the disciplines, but also learn and grow from each other. And I think something that's wonderful about campus communities is that there are pockets of all kinds of people who are wanting to engage like this. And you have to do the work sometimes to seek it out. So that was my own experience with that. But I also think that research is an excellent place for rebellion. I just think that research has incredible possibilities and potentialities that following a set script doesn't have to happen. You can be rigorous while also being creative. You can have methodological depth while also dabbling into these different interdisciplinary ways of engaging. And when you're really trying to solve the problem, for me personally, I don't understand how we get at some of the big structural things without understanding them in the larger context. That said, I also really appreciate people who have specialized knowledge. And so something that I pull from Dr. David Stovall, who is at the University of Chicago. He's incredible, teacher and researcher and human, but he suggests that we look at our work as a collective. So instead of embracing this kind of hyper competitive way of thinking about my work as separate, as individual, as unique, as special, rather my work is connected to Sirrita's work. My work is connected to Elizabeth and Jamon's. And it's centered in the grand scheme of justice, that we want to do the big picture. And so what puzzle piece am I adding? And that gives me great hope, even if it's really difficult sometimes, all the time, very difficult to do, conceptualize. But even as I sit here and tell you, this is the work that I do, the work that I do is always the work that we do. It's always in community, it's always in connection. And if I can't connect individually with everyone here, all behind me, these are all of my connections. Most of these are documentary histories. So these are collections of words of the past. And you don't have to have them in book form. I think that the digital realm has really opened up and democratized how we also engage with history and the opportunities for exploring methodological pluralism and other ways that we might engage. But for me, the biggest part is that community part. I don't see my research as the research that I do solely, even as I still have to do some work that's individual. It's always collective. It's always part of a bigger picture and a larger narrative.
Yeah, my answer was both and. Like there's not an either or. It's like we need this and we need that, right? We need to be doing both. And like Tonya said, like I think data is important and it's so buzzworthy, and being a researcher, I know how data is important, but I also know how data can tell 10 different stories. So making sure we're intentional about what route we're taking. I'm a practitioner, so I'm just always going to take that route. But making sure we're still like looking at all the research, like Tonya said, it's a collective. And if we look at the collective, that we're solving a collective issue and being a collective solution to what the issues we're trying to solve. And especially when it comes to storytelling, making sure it's a collective story and not in just individual stories that is changing that narrative.
Oh, I totally agree. As I was thinking about, how storytelling and narratives, how powerful they can be. The essential part, I think, has to do with that understanding that it is a collective, as Tonya mentioned, the sense of there will always be those who came before us, there will always be those who follow us. And once we understand that, then it becomes a more humbling, experience, because you realize that you have a responsibility to those on either side of you to do your best and to bring forth an authentic story from your own voice, and to gather other voices and make sure that, I think coming from Detroit, which is such a musical city, I find myself so often thinking about the silences between the notes, thinking about the things that are left unsaid and how powerful they are, just as the stories are. So when I hear those silences, it makes me very curious and makes me want to find out what's missing and what yet has to be done. And that's what's going to lead us to, that next story that may help fill in that missing part. So when it's coming to the healing, for those who maybe are still holding it within, and then when they're able to finally, bring that, lift that voice, I don't think it's any coincidence that the Black national anthem is lift every voice and sing, because it's every voice has to be there in order for it to be the true story. And that's our mission, that's our goal. We may never, get to that, but it's such a powerful thing to imagine being able to one day do. And so I think that that's something that using storytelling for that possibility is just something that I just think is such a beautiful thing that will help us to really understand the United States of America, because right now it feels very much as though we're not united. We are, we're in a state of kind of, not really taking advantage of all the incredible voices we have. So the more we can try to strive to bring those together, wow, that's where the social justice work comes in. And, when we start to hear all of those voices. And so I thank you all both for sharing, because I think that that's some ways that may be helpful to the person who asked the question. Let's see, we have another question that says, I have students in my developmental psychology class who write blogs about how their experiences relate to the concepts covered in the class, and to challenge the material with their own lived experiences. I also use personal narratives or family narratives, but I struggle with ensuring that some of the assumptions embedded in these assignments might be harmful because of lost stories, erased stories, trauma stories. Also, the grade is based upon simply going through the process. How can we incorporate these things while at the same time acknowledging the privilege embedded in some framing and assumptions? Wow, that's quite a question. Ooh, would either of you like to tackle that one?
Yeah, I can hop in. And I think this may have been answered maybe before, but I think this is going back to Baba Jamon's point, that, assumptions, you kill those with actually experiences, real experiences. And I've had assignments too where the voice of the privilege is always lifted more. Even just in my classroom doing like oral literature, oral history projects. So it happens. So making sure we're getting into communities and making sure their voices are lifted. So right now I told you all travel. And one of the things I do is go into Indigenous communities where their native tongue is no longer appreciated. And I really want to lift up their voices in a language that's now being erased because we're not lifting up Indigenous voices. And I've been collecting their stories because I know there's power in telling Indigenous people's stories. And people are always just like, what are you doing? Like, you're traveling by yourself, going into Indigenous communities. But I think it's important because people don't go into these communities and really get the stories of these individuals, and really it preserves the culture, right? Because we are really erasing cultures that when we don't lift up their voices, right? It's just another erasure of who these people are. So making sure we're intentional, and maybe the assignment outline, like, are we making sure we're strategic and intentional and making sure that's somewhere in the outline that we are lifting up the less privileged voices, and that actually is a requirement on the rubric. So making sure that's actually embedded in writing, because that means you have a service to actually committing to that, and if you do, then your students will as well.
Yeah, I want to add on to that, and then perhaps also tackle another question that I see in the Q&A that's around the challenges of storytelling, that not everybody's stories are going to have the same impact in the telling, no matter who is telling it. And how do we protect the people, especially youth and others behind the stories we center, while still lifting the voices authentically. And I'm thinking one of the things that we haven't quite said, but perhaps is common, is I think the importance of reflexivity. So one of the things I think about a lot, and I have to think about too, especially as a white researcher, is critical self-reflection and the work that takes, the kinds of communities that I build in order to help think through that. So I think that reflexivity is built in there too, but I also, in my own teaching, I prefer a co-teaching model. And some of that I think comes from my background in intergroup dialogue, where we were intentionally having structured conversations around difficult topics. And we were pulling in different social identity groups at a time. And at the time I was doing dialogues on race and ethnicity. And I was doing this through University of Michigan School of Social Work, and it's with youth. And so it is the summer youth program on dialogues in race and ethnicity. And for those, we've been talking a lot about Detroit, but Michigan in and of itself is a very interesting space because it's hyper segregated. So that means that you can go anywhere in Michigan and generally you're going to see hyper some group of people when it comes to race and ethnicity. In the South, it's not the same way. It's a little bit different, at least in my experience in Georgia. There's a little more blending when it comes to who you see when you go to the supermarket, or who you don't see when you go to the supermarket. And so with that, I often ask my students and myself, how do I intervene on what segregation, racialized segregation, and white supremacy continues to do to my life? And one of those things is reflexivity. I think the other component of that is working in community. So I co-teach across difference all the time, intentionally. And then the third piece is I work really hard to think about, how do we restore after conflict? So in doing this work, it's likely someone's going to get hurt. It's likely that people will suffer and something will come out. And we have to not shy away from that. But that also requires attention to particular kinds of skills, because I think people genuinely don't, well, the people that are interested in this and that we're thinking about it, we don't want to re-traumatize. People don't want to hurt each other. There is respect and love and care. But that also means sometimes that you have to be able to work through conflict and understand that once harm has happened, that you'll be able to intervene on that by doing the reparative work. And that's a whole other set of skills and experiences, doing reparative work, like acknowledging the things that I have done that might hurt someone else, or being able to make space for hearing. And in other spaces, sometimes people will talk about truth telling and truth and reconciliation commissions. And I think a lot about how is it that communities have been able to live side by side after incredible acts of violence have happened. And you have to live next to your neighbor. There has to be some ways to engage in reconciliation. And it's not perfect. It's not perfect. It doesn't erase what happens. But I think that there is something very powerful in acknowledging, so that people then can move from acknowledgement to whatever that next step is for them. And I don't know how people embed that in research, but I definitely try to embed it in some of my teaching. And sometimes, I'll be honest, sometimes I have to repair what I tried to repair, because we're humans and we do this work, but the larger objective of justice that is going to take all of us, interracial coalitions, intersectional coalitions, we're all going to have to do it. I think those skills are going to be just really crucial so that we can work together, even through some of the hard stuff. But that's my personal take on it.
Wow, thank you so much. As we're drawing closer to the end of our time together, I was wondering if you all could share with me and with our audience, of course, what are the things that still give you hope in the midst of all of this work, which I know is hard. And after now 40 years, within the field of public librarianship and working in Africana studies here at U of M, it takes a toll on you, but at the same time, it also is so rewarding and offers me a lot of hope. What offers you all hope with the work that you're doing?
I think young people give me hope. I think history gives me hope. We've seen wins from people who have mobilized large amounts of people to create change. So what gives me hope too is movement, a movement of people asking for a thing or fighting for a thing. I know that it will happen. I think the joy of fighting for it though is that we might not live to see it happen, but that's the joy of fighting. And that's why I'll continue to fight, and why I believe young people are our greatest gift in this time. And again, always just giving them the tools they need to solve their own problems. It makes me hopeful because they are, again, the best teachers that we've ever had.
Yeah, for me, I think hope always comes from being able to engage in communities, in any kind of community or collective sharing practice. And then also I will always have hope in the incredible capabilities of youth. When we would do restorative work, they could have some of the most intense experiences with each other around conflict, but also the most, they were very quick to embrace how to work through it with tools, and they wanted to do it, and they taught us a lot. So I think if we can figure out ways to authentically also bring youth into the spaces that we are engaging with, especially around education, in an authentic way. So that means really actually questioning how we see and hear youth voices. Do we see and hear, and do we actually give them space to express themselves in a way that isn't patronizing and doesn't continually privilege adultness? Not easy to do perhaps, but really important.
I agree. I think, working with the youth, I always feel as though, I feel about that parable of the, throwing out the seeds onto the land. And, you never know. And that's the beauty of working with young people, when each one is going to begin to rise from the soil, and to not have expectations of them all coming up at once. But, even when I would talk with parents about literacy acquisition, I was like, one child may take to it right away. Others may take their time and kind of move into it in a different way. And so knowing that, that potential is there, and just being sure to nourish as best you can, it really is the thing that gives me such great hope. There's no time that I'm not, seeing young people and not feeling a great sense of joy and hope, and just the sense of what may come of this. It just makes me feel as though, all the things that we're doing and that each of you is doing is lending itself to a better day tomorrow. And I don't think we can ask for more. So with that, I will turn it back to Dr. Wilson and let her close us out.
Well, thank you. This time has been so rich and wonderful. Again, I appreciate you all, Ms. James, Drs. Darby and Kneff-Chang, and Mr. Jordan, who needed to leave a bit early to tend to an urgent matter. We're so grateful that you have shared your insight and advice and critical reflections. Thank you for emphasizing the importance of incorporating critical perspectives of history and storytelling into our teaching and our research. And indeed, no matter what we study and teach, you all have reminded us how history, power dynamics, and acts of both erasure and reclamation matter. Thus, we as educators and scholars have to be intentional in infusing critical history into our work, so we understand our present better and we help shape a more just future for our students and for our educational spaces and community. I also want to thank you all, our audience members, for joining us and likely spending your precious lunchtime in this space. We at the Create Center hope you will stay connected. We're going to drop a link to our website where you can sign up for more information about the center and our work, or connect with us via social media. So may we all be able to uncover and share more critical stories for truth-telling, liberation, and healing. Thanks everyone, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And I'm sending prayers, thoughts, and hopes for action for Buffalo. My heart goes out.